Here we go. Kia ora katoa. Welcome back, everybody, to a podcast I've been wanting to get done for some time with Dr. Abby Thompson. Hopefully, Abby is going to talk to me like a Labrador so I can understand what she's talking about. We're talking about the future of food. I think we're going to touch on some genetic engineering, genetic modification, the difference between the two, how we might be producing food in the future without necessarily passing through an animal. And I'm intrigued to learn more. So this podcast for me is a podcast of discovery, and I have a feeling it might be one of two podcasts, because talking with people like Abby, who, by the way, thinks she's boring, can be really dense with lots of new information. So wish me luck as I stumble into this world of the future of food. Hope you enjoy it. Three, two, one. Here we go. Welcome back, everybody. I am this morning. I've pressed go because I am with Dr. Abby Thompson, who finds that very pretentious. And we've got the giggles, and I thought, actually, we should get started before we go after it. Abby, good morning.
Good morning, Harv.
And Abby is going to be the most boring podcast person ever.
Yep, there's something to aspire to.
That's the aspiration. I have been trying to get this podcast for how long?
Maybe 4 years.
Maybe 4 years.
Yeah.
And Abby said, no, not yet. It's never been a complete no, it's just been a not yet. And so we sort of dug into about that earlier on. We might get to that earlier. What are you, Abby, so people know?
You're meaning what am I in terms of my career? I mean, that's a pretty big question.
Yeah.
I'm a food scientist originally, but I've also worked in nutrition. I'm a farmer's daughter. My parents are veterinarians, but they had a sheep and beef farm when I was younger. And I guess I am someone who's fundamentally interested in how we create, consume food and what it does to us. Because that whole thing of the way that food and people interact is something that goes back to the dawn of time. And that just fascinates me.
And what are you really good at?
Oh, this is a tricky one because there's someone better at me than everything. But I think I am quite good at trying to pull together different parts of a puzzle and help things work or hopefully make sense. You can tell me at the end of this whether I've helped things make sense or not.
You better. Yeah. Otherwise, we're not putting it up.
That'll be good.
And you are the CEO of...
No, I am the COO. Different sets of acronyms.
COO.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about that.
So Chief Operating Officer of a startup called Maruku. And Maruku is in the alternative protein space or crop biotech, depending on what you want to call it. And so my CEO, so the big boss, is a guy by the name of Amos Palfreyman. And my job is to do whatever it is that he needs done that for whatever reason he can't or doesn't want to do himself. And Amos and I have worked together for probably the last 5 or 6 years. So when I was the CEO of Food HQ, I employed him to come and be my effective, 2IC. And so we worked together there. So we've swapped the hierarchy, but we work together in pretty much the same way we always did. He's brilliant at being the consummate networker, the person out the front who has all of that charisma and X factor that just makes people really want to know him and talk to him. And I'm quite happy being a little bit behind, but looking at what's going on and helping prepare stuff and pull things together and make things work.
So he would have done the podcast 4 years ago.
He would have done it 4 years ago, absolutely.
Right, and had no content and wouldn't have worried, it just stepped up and we had a
He
good
would
chat.
have stepped up and had a chat and it would have been fabulous and you would have loved him. And then he would have moved on to the next thing and it wouldn't have ever loitered in his mind for a moment.
So Abby, where did you grow up on this farming?
Around the Manawatu.
Yep.
So my parents are both veterinarians and originally they were working for MAF Bachelor Centre, which is kind of over in Palmerston North across the river. And then Dad decided he wanted to go back into research and academia, so he went to Massey. And of course, in New Zealand, if you want to be an academic in veterinary science, Massey is the only place you can do that. And so it sort of meant we've moved around the Manawatu, but always been within kind of commuting distance to Massey.
Is it true that Palmerston's got more PhDs per something or other
Per capita than anywhere else?
Yeah.
It is repeated often, and I think there is some credibility to it in terms of if you think about, only a couple of 100,000 people, and we've got all of these research centres. You've got the DHB, Fonterra's research centre, all of that kind of stuff. But I've looked for the original source before, and I've never been able to find it.
Right, so it might be just an urban myth.
Yeah.
It sounds good, though.
It
and
does.
it sort of makes sense when which is not commonly, it's not seen, but all that research sits there. It's a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's where, Tim and I, we were overseas in the UK for 6 years. And then when we were thinking of where to come back to, we briefly sort of thought, we could go where there's beaches, where there's, more sunshine hours, all these things. And then we kind of went, well, where can we afford to buy a house? Where are our families? And where are the really cool jobs in particularly the sort of agri-food related space? And for me, well, that pretty much meant Manawatu.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a great place to bring up kids. It is incredibly there's a whole lot of positives for the place. It's just not the sexiest place in the country.
And I think whenever I would be recruiting people to come and join when I was working at Massey or wherever, one of the things that I would say to them is, if they are able to be in charge of making their own fun, would you like to come around to have a meal tonight? Or would you like to go for a walk? Or how about we do this thing? You will be fine. You will love it. If you need external creation of, here's a list of the activities that are on and I can go and do one, Manawatu's probably not your thing.
You know what? That is a really, really great distinction. I have suffered from the latter from time to time. Okay, that's given me something to think about. Yeah, because, I mean, the thing that, our business is based here, and the talent pool here is sensational. It really is.
Well, I remember when I was at Food HQ, we'd have these conversations about, attracting talent. And one of the things to me was clever, smart, interesting people often are married to other clever, smart, interesting people. And so if you employ one, you're often dragging another one with you. And so you end up with all of these partners and spouses who haven't got that core employment but then they're looking for work. And so often they end up doing things that maybe might not have been their first choice or is flowing into something else. But, you are elevating the capacity or the capability throughout all the broader sort of aligning sectors as well.
Yep. So, Abby, I was going to frame it this way. What don't you want to talk about today? Because you don't want to do this podcast, but we're doing it.
We are.
We're doing it. And what I was so excited when I woke up this morning because you sent through this list. And it's stuff I'm really interested in. It's stuff I don't know about. And I know it's there. I know it's there. I know it's coming. And it's going to impact the whole of the country. So I'm going to frame up this before our conversation. In 1957, we were the second or third wealthiest country in the world. and our economy was based on agriculture. And we'd had the benefit of the Korean War and Vietnam, and war was highly sought after, and being on the Wool Board was the equivalent of, or maybe even higher than being in cabinet. And those white men hung out with the board of Rothmans, and they were all of the same overlap. And farmers sheep farmers were the wealthiest, some of the wealthiest people in the world as an industry. And if you come forward to now, we are ranked 34th wealthiest country in the world, and the countries that are wealthier than us don't have agriculture as their primary income generator. And so we're going to have to change something to boost our economy. And I think we have pushed the dairy production thing as far as we can, in my opinion. And there's some other stuff we need to. And I can see little signs in the meat industry where there are some real innovators who have got really interested in producing meat, not for the calories, but producing meat with health benefits, and and so I see changes there, and I see little sparks within the wool industry of people starting to produce wool for specific markets and breeding wool for those markets and getting phenomenal. And I'm not just talking about merino, I'm talking about in crossbreed as well, and targeting stuff there. So I see, so that's my context. Anything to add to that context, Abby?
I guess simply to say that I don't know the answers. I don't think there is yet a clear and obvious, this is the one true path, or this is the thing. I think, though, what I'm keen to be doing is, let's make sure we start having more of these discussions, because I worry that there is a degree of emu head in the sand about some stuff. But I also think there's a whole bunch of things going on where there is overhype, and people have, said, we've got to get rid of every cow, we've got to do it, And I don't think that either of these things is necessarily true. It's more nuanced and more subtle than that. But, that makes it harder. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth trying to unpick or to pursue as well.
So, Abby, let's just kick off with your PhD in what?
So my PhD was in food science, and what I was doing was taking what they call phospholipids, which are a particular part of milk, and I was using them to make tiny little bubbles where you had maybe a particular bioactive that might have health benefits or something inside a bubble, and you put these phospholipids around the outside of that bubble to hold that bubble and protect it, if you like. So you could put that bubble into foods or beverages, and then people would be able to consume that and then get the benefit of whatever you had put inside those bubbles. And this whole idea was that sometimes what we're wanting to put into foods for the health benefits are unstable, and so we've got to do something to keep them safe between the point which we put them into the product and the point that someone actually consumes them. And so it was all about, we call it microencapsulation. So, effectively wrapping up in tiny little packages, good stuff, to try and make sure it's going to be available to do the good thing when it actually is required.
And what was the biggest learning while you did that PhD?
That the most important things I got out of it were determination, perseverance, problem solving, and the knowledge that I had a doctor in front of my name and I knew how little I knew about most stuff. And therefore, if I came across someone else who had a doctor in front of their name and they were spouting off something, I had permission to also go, you know what, I don't think you necessarily are always going to be right.
Nice. Nice. Ain't that true?
Yeah.
It's I won't go down the rabbit hole, but it's you see politicians and so forth getting up there and going, I know the way. I'm going, oh, you lying dick. That's just, and just like you framed up before, is that there's no absolute. No. Okay, so we've got some topics today, Abby, that you sent through, which I'm really... Which do you want to kick off with? Is there a sequence you want to talk about?
No, I think probably we'll surf the waves of where things go. But I guess maybe if it's useful, perhaps I could start off by talking about what it is that Maruku, the company that I'm working for, is trying to do. So basically, if in the simplest possible kind of phrase, we are making plants that will make dairy. And if we start to unpick that a bit, what that means is that when you grow a plant, basically you are using sunlight via the power of photosynthesis to create proteins and fats and carbohydrates and nutrients that then can be either used by that plant or could also be used by humans or animals. If we feed that plant to a cow, that cow will then eat those proteins and fats and carbohydrates from the plant and use them to make different proteins and fats, some of which will go into actually building the cow, so growth of the cow, so the muscle and things, and some, in many cases, to produce milk that we may then
and
eat.
Some of it's excreted.
And some of it's excreted and all of that kind of stuff. And those different proteins that have been made by the animal behave in different ways in the foods that we eat. And sometimes they've got different nutritional properties. Sometimes they are able to do things like create the stretch that we have in cheese, or the foaming that we'll have in whipped cream, or if you talk about the fats, the crunch or the flake in kind of pastries, a good croissant or that kind of thing. And so in many cases, they can be better at creating those sensory experiences or some of the nutritional stuff that humans have come to enjoy over the past however many years, compared to those proteins and fats that we would get directly from the plant. Now, if we pause for a moment, I think most people, I'm hoping I'm not being too provocative just yet, would say that they understand that for the sustainability of the planet, we need to look at how we reduce the consumption of meat and dairy in many populations. Not saying we want to get rid of it completely, but, we need to look at reducing. We should eat more plants. And the simplest way to do that...
Just stop there. Yep. Why do we need to do that?
Basically because of the inefficiencies that come from a conversion of that plant protein, fats, carbohydrates into whatever it is that as humans we would eat, because you mentioned some of those proteins get excreted, some go into just keeping the cow's heart beating and all of these sorts of things. And also there is that additional environmental impact associated with animals in terms of waterways and nitrogen excretion and all of these sorts of things. Methane, burps, farts, all of that kind of stuff. If we could just eat the plant, we would have more efficiency in terms of the conversion of those nutrients into our energy and need for running, and we would also avoid that methane, that urea excretion, all of that kind of stuff as well. So if I was making life really simple for everyone, we would all just eat chickpeas or whatever. We would just go and I know that there is discussion about, how do you try and get enough protein? How do you get enough zinc? How do you get enough calcium? All of these things. And, that's valid in some cases. Protein's not as complex as many people feel it is, as long as you eat a variety of different plants. But fundamentally, people don't like just eating plants all the time. There are a small proportion of vegans out there, but a lot of people really enjoy the sensory characteristics that come with eating good food. And there's so much cultural heritage. There's the nostalgia about what you grew up with. There's just what tastes good, the different textures, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's why we've had companies over this last however long trying to take plants and make them into things that are more like the dairy equivalents or the meat equivalents. Because they're trying to bridge this gap of how do we use those plants but still get all of that other stuff that we're just talking about. But it's actually really hard for many of those products. Anyone who's really tried to eat plant-based cheeses or, most plant-based meats, they can be really tasty. but they're not the same. They don't have the same sensory characteristics. And I have tasted an awful lot of plant-based cheeses and meats in my time. They're getting better, but there's still quite a long way to go. And part of that is fundamentally the structures of the proteins and fats are different. So in dairy proteins, they're kind of long and if you like, kind of think about a little bit like spaghetti. And so they can interact with each other, those proteins. And so when you do things like create cheese, you pull and they can kind of move past, but they're interacting, so they pull against each other and they stretch. If you think of the plant proteins, they're globular, so they're like little ball bearings. And so you kind of think of, they just kind of roll past each other. They don't actually really interact with each other in the same way. And so you don't get that same texture, you don't get that same kind of experience of eating. And so there's all sorts of different ways that different companies around the world are trying to address this, and we can talk about those more shortly. But what we're trying to do is say, well, hey, maybe we could just make those proteins, those long kind of proteins that interact with each other like we would get out of dairy, directly in the plant. And so now with the power of genetic technologies, we can actually, if you like, write a little package of code, of DNA code, that will be able to tell that plant how to make those proteins and tell them where to store it. So we're telling them to store it in the seed because that's what we would then harvest and use. And so we can have a plant that grows. It uses photosynthesis to make all of its normal proteins and all of its normal fats that it needs to be able to grow and be a healthy plant. But it also makes a small amount of these proteins that we've told it how to make, which are these dairy proteins. We harvest those seeds using all of the normal equipment that we would normally use, so your combine harvesters and all those sorts of things, and we can ship it around in trucks or put it in your grain silos, again, all the stuff you normally would use. And we can take those seeds and make them into ingredients that then food manufacturers can use to make foods, but they've got those proteins in there, or they've got those fats in there that mean the resulting animal-free, plant-based foods will hopefully taste and have the nutritional attributes as if we had used dairy in them.
And they'll have these characteristics of the stringy...
Of being able to make stretchy cheese or whatever it might be.
Right.
And so it's kind of, I guess, recognising the human failure, the human failing of we really love food. We really want to have food that we enjoy eating. Yeah, we could just eat lentils and whatever, but we don't want to, most of us. So how can we kind of help ourselves out by making plant-based foods that are like the next generation of them? And we've done an awful lot of work all around the world to try and just work out how we can process plants better to make better things, but there's kind of a wall that's been hit there. And if anyone saw the news recently, Sunfed, which is a New Zealand plant-based food company, has just announced they're closing down because they haven't managed to convert consumers to being able to continuing to buy their products at a price point and at a regularity that is needed to be viable in the business. And that's happening all around the world because fundamentally people are willing to try these plant-based foods. They're even willing to go, well, I probably should buy them more often, but if they don't taste really good, it's really easy to drift away back to things that do, especially if you're not sure if the kids are going to eat them or you're going to have people around for dinner or whatever it might be.
And you see people just throwing a whole lot of sugar into products to make them taste good.
Yep, salt and sugar and fat. Yep.
Yeah, and bingo, you've got a hamburger. Yeah.
And so I think, this isn't something that's easy. If it was, it would already be done. But I think it's something that's really exciting. And the reason that I joined Maruku from Food HQ was that in my role at Food HQ, I had spent years looking at all of these different technologies that were out there that people were saying were going to be the thing that would, effectively transform our food production systems and would enable the cheap and sustainable production of proteins or whatever in a different way. And every single one, I could kind of see advantages of it in some ways, but there were all of these sorts of flags of, but. And then when Amos came to me and he said, he had formed this company with his other founders, and this is what they were going to do. It was like lights kind of went, yes, because all of a sudden you are not having to have a whole lot of new infrastructure. Once you've got these seeds, you can grow them and harvest them and process them using everything we already have. You compare that with some of these other technologies where there's this incredible infrastructure that we need to build of great big stainless steel vats to be able to do fermentation with yeasts and different kinds of bacteria, and then you get this great big soup mix, and you've got to kind of go through and just pick out the proteins that you want, and what do you do with all the rest of the stuff, and all of those sorts of complexities. This just seemed really elegant. And I like the fact that the whole approach we're taking is to try and utilize the whole seed. We know that up front we're probably not going to be able to find a human use for every part of the seed, but that's the ultimate goal. We might be playing just a bit with some of the proteins, but how can we develop ingredients where there's also the native plant proteins that are there too? Because you only need a small amount of these dairy proteins to give things like the stretch or the fluff or the whatever, and we want more proteins in there from a nutrition perspective, so let's use those plant proteins.
What's interesting, when we've sat down and I had to finally convince you to do this really boring podcast, which is not, by the way, and you're framing this up, I wasn't thinking about the seed.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about the seed, I go, oh yeah. I was thinking about the rest of the plant. And this now makes so much more sense to me. I go, oh yeah, the seed, that's right.
Yep.
Yeah. What range of plants are you, and this might be commercially sensitive, I don't know, but what range of plants are you looking at?
So we're looking at oilseed plants. So for people who are, not familiar with that category, it includes things like soy, canola, safflower, the plants that usually have both an oil component as well as other parts. And we started out looking at soy because that's such a big, huge crop. But we've now, after many discussions internally with regulators in key markets, and that have decided to go with safflower. And safflower is a plant many people haven't heard of. And that's a good thing when it comes to regulators, because they go, well, if you're going to be doing something different, actually doing something different in a crop where there's not a lot of it out there makes them feel much more relaxed than you doing something different with something which feeds half of the world.
Right.
And because we believe that to make this work, we're going to have to be growing it outside, and we're going to have to be growing it in fields. Some of the other companies out there who are startups that are trying to do similar things seem to be at the moment looking at whether they can do stuff in glass houses. But to me, I just don't understand how you're going to achieve the scale that we need to feed the people that we need to feed doing things with indoor growing for this kind of thing. And so safflower at the moment is grown often for the oil. And so you will see in many cases, even things like infant formula, or it will say on the back, contains sunflower or safflower oil or something like that. And the protein component is often just, you squish the seed, you take the oil away, and then the rest is fed to animals. And so farmers around the world have sometimes grown safflower because the oil is worth a bit, and it's got good agronomic benefits. It's drought resistant. It will grow in sodic soils, so soils that are not so high quality, have been perhaps a bit damaged, but got a bit high salt or something like that. If it's wind resistant, there's a whole lot of that sort of stuff there. So if the climate's a bit iffy, it's more likely you're going to get a decent crop still out of safflower than some of these other crops. And it's got a really deep taproot. And so it can go right down into the soil and help aerate it, break it up a bit. And if, for instance, you have had a irrigated crop on it, the previous crop rotation, often that crop might have shallower roots, and it's taken the water out of that top bit that you've put in, but there's a whole lot of water that you've put on that field that was then not used. So you can follow with the safflower, and the safflower is able to then access that water and make sure that the whole thing doesn't become waterlogged. And so farmers were growing it almost as an agronomic kind of thing rather than because it made them a lot of money.
Can you grow this in New Zealand?
Yes, there were, safflower you can grow in New Zealand. There were trials actually done by AgResearch around the Waikato and other parts of New Zealand back in the sort of 70s, 80s that showed it growed really well. We would not be growing it in New Zealand at the moment, at least, because we are using genetic technologies and New Zealand's current regulations do not permit them. So our intent is to commercialise in Australia. Australia is much more relaxed about the use of genetic technologies in these sorts of crops. And in fact, in the last couple of years, they have released and commercialised a couple of oilseed genetically modified crops. One was a safflower that had they'd changed the oil profile to be more of a high, super high oleic, or another one was canola that has got sort of like omega-3 fats in it. And so there's a pathway there that we're following. And then the other major market we're looking at is North America, so probably either Canada or the States.
And so how does that sit with you having Maruku, which is a New Zealand-based company, developing this in other countries and not being able to develop it here?
I think it's something which I feel a little bit torn about. I think on one hand, when we think of the people who are working in Maruku, a large proportion of us are New Zealanders. 3 of the 4 founders are New Zealanders. And we would love to do something that was going to be adding value to New Zealand. And, it would be wonderful if people wanted to grow it here that they could. But I also respect that as a nation at the moment, the regulations have said people don't want to be a country that does genetically engineered crops and things like that. I am pleased that there is an announcement by the government that they're going to have looking at this more. But I also wouldn't want something to be pushed through that the majority of people really didn't want. I hope we can find a pathway there that people were going to be comfortable with. If New Zealand didn't want to do this, that would be okay with me. We're not going to be having one solution for everybody. There will be people out there, countries out there, who will say, you know what, genetically modified stuff isn't for me. And it's like, that's cool. But there will also be a whole bunch of people out there who go, I'm prepared to accept a compromise, if you like, of having genetic modification in some of my food in return for the advantages that it gives me, whether that be improved health benefits or improved sensory or higher yield, so therefore the price is cheaper, or whatever it might be. And I think it's just making sure that we don't look at it as an all or nothing thing. There will be a portfolio of solutions that different people can then choose from.
Interesting you say that, because that's what's going through my mind. I get frustrated sometimes that so the end of life bill, for instance, when that came in, I wasn't for that initially. I was concerned that our society was not evolved enough to be able to embrace that. It seems as though we are. And it seems as though we have adapted to that, and I think that is quietly, being embedded. So I think that's an example for me that I was like, no, I'm not cool with that. And the thing with the genetically modified stuff, whatever, I'm going, well, we've got this nice, pure thing going on with New Zealand, which I know doesn't hold a lot of water in other aspects. So I've got that, and I'm going, but there's so much of it I actually don't understand. So I hear the extreme bad stuff, and I go, I don't want that.
Yeah.
And I don't know the more subtle other areas.
And I think, like many things, technology has come on massively, and I found it really interesting learning about how some of the plant breeding goes on that is considered non-GE, that's considered just traditional plant breeding, which can involve effectively exposing the plant seed or germplasm to radiation or chemicals that will effectively cause that plant to mutate in random and uncontrolled and unknown ways. And then we grow those seeds and we look for the phenotypes, the characteristics or the behaviours that we think we want, and we go, aha, that one seems to be what we're after, or that's got whatever it is, and you take that, and then we keep working with that. And we have no idea what other things have changed in there. We can just see, or we've measured that thing. With the kinds of modern technology, we're okay with that. You know, that's traditional. With the money, we can change something, and we know what we've changed, and we know we have changed nothing else, and yet that is considered scary, bad.
Yep.
You know, modification.
That's me.
Yeah.
Yep. That's me.
And you know, I think, to me, when I started thinking of it a bit more like that, you know, this whole traditional, random, unknown, who knows what else might be in there. Hang on a moment. Why are we saying that is completely okay, yet this idea of precision changes that are only changing what we have asked to do is bad? And it's this technology kind of concept of, you know, but I think we need to understand more about, well, actually, what is the change that has happened and what is the risk associated with that? And let's perhaps not think so much about the how we've got there, and more what is evaluate the end product and its own merits. And I feel quite anxious about the risk to New Zealand of just saying blanket no to all of these things, because so many other countries around the world, even those like Europe, who have traditionally said we don't want GE, have now recognised that some of these they call them gene editing techniques, so where you're making these precision changes, they can cause changes that you could achieve by the traditional circular kind of traditional breeding route, but you can get there really quickly, really efficiently. And if I gave you 2 seeds, you would not be able to tell how it had happened. And so they've started to say, well, actually, if the changes you are making in a plant are just the sort of changes that you could have achieved by breeding in the traditional way, well, that's fine. You don't have to label it genetically engineered or anything. It's because you're evaluating the risk of that final product. And so you could do things like say, oh, we want to tweak the flowering time of a particular plant because we recognise with climate change there's a shift in the seasons, and so we need to make sure it's actually flowering at a time when the temperatures are right and the bees are there and the weather's doing what it needs to do. Or you could start to say, I'm going to stop requiring a particular fruit like kiwi fruit to have a male plant and a female plant for pollination, and I'll make it self-pollinating like a lot of other fruits are. And then I no longer need to have 1/6 or 1/10 of my orchard in plants that are not actually producing. So my yield goes up instantly. Or you could say that I want to be able to produce a cherry or a tomato or a kiwi fruit that has 10 times higher of a particular polyphenol or health giving chemical naturally present in that, so that when I eat that, I'm boosting my immune system and I'm having all of these other things, and I would have usually had to eat 10 of these fruit, but now I can get away with just having 1. You know, there's all of these things that we can do so much more efficiently. That could take 15 years if we were going to do it in the traditional way.
Yep. And it's interesting when I hear you talk like that, the big scary monster thing starts to diminish. And I was also reflecting like stem cell, right? Now, I really like the idea of stem cells. Yeah. And I think I've got an emotional thing there that I think if we can nail that, I think makes so much difference. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it is mind-blowing what is potentially possible with some of this stuff. I think there's also some really interesting ethical kind of things to think through. And, you know, I think many people feel more comfortable with the idea of these technologies for medicine, so for potentially saving people's lives or improving quality of lives. When it comes to food and ag, I think it's a little bit more complex. But I would suggest, I believe many people are more comfortable with us modifying plants compared to us modifying animals. I might be wrong there, but I think in general, you know, there's probably a lower hurdle for acceptance there. The evidence or the papers that I've seen where they've kind of done consumer sort of insights, also suggests people are more comfortable with this kind of technology being used if the consumer is benefiting rather than the farmer or the producer. So if, for instance, this technology is going to give me a health benefit, or it means that the fruit is going to be able to last longer in my pantry, or it is going to be able to not need as many sprays, so it's kind of a lower spray fruit, then, okay, that seems a benefit that I potentially would have value in. When it came to things like putting the Roundup resistant gene into crops so that a farmer could spray Roundup over the entire crop, kill off the weeds, and the plant kept going, the consumer sees very little value for them in that. That makes it easier for the farmer. Where's the value for me? I'm just eating something that had Roundup spray on it, and no thank you. So I think it's also understanding who is the value for and what does that value look like. And does that then make somebody feel more, oh yeah, that's I can see that, or no?
Abby, what's your view on the pure New Zealand thing?
I would lovely if it was true. I think that there are parts of it that are, and we are on the Te Araroa Trail here in Fielding, and we host, we're trail angels, which basically means people who are walking the trail can contact us, and they can come and pitch their tent on the lawn or stay in the sleep out. We'll cook them a meal, these sorts of things. And so we get to chat to people who have come here from all around the world, and they almost always talk about how beautiful our country is and how much they are enjoying walking through it. And I think on that level, there is a lot that New Zealand is fabulous. I do feel deeply uncomfortable with our river quality and the whole idea that whenever we go somewhere, we take Eleanor to have a picnic at a river, Tim's on his phone looking up whether the water is actually swimmable, and all too often it's not. I do feel uncomfortable about this idea that seems to now be pervading our political and agriculture sector of we have to decide if we want economic growth or environmental sustainability, that these things are, effectively mutually exclusive. Interestingly, when I spent time talking to people over in the Netherlands and the States and others in part of my previous role, what I realised is very few people saw New Zealand as a high-tech a country. They saw us almost as slightly old-fashioned, slightly quaint, with the fact that we still had animals out on the fields. Kind of, it was lovely. It was, but not particularly advanced, not particularly modern, and that really floored me, because I think New Zealanders tell themselves this story that we are innovators, this whole number 8 wire, the America's Cup, we make things happen on the smell of an oily rag and we beat the world. And actually, I don't think that in many cases that's the way the rest of the world view us. And I think we need to find out what identity we want to have for ourselves in the future, but I don't think pure New Zealand is an identity that's either entirely credible or doesn't really fit with us now. And if we want it, we've got to make some serious changes, or else we've got to find out what identity we do want to have.
What identity do you want the country to have?
It almost doesn't matter what I want. We've got to find it as a collective. I don't know, Harv. I haven't thought about it, but I would love it to be somewhere that people really wanted to live, and we had that high quality of life that you talked about right at the beginning. I see so much inequity, so much poverty these days. And I mean, when Tim and I went to the UK, we went in 2007, one of the things that blew my mind when I went over there initially was that inequity in wealth. You would wander around London or whatever, and you'd see these properties, and you would think, if you are not born into that kind of money, the chances of you ever being able to mix in those circles or to buy those things are just so tiny, it's insignificant. And I took great pride in telling people that in New Zealand, you know, you walk along the beachfront or you walk along whatever, and anything you saw, with a bit of luck and hard work, there was a chance that you could buy that one day.
Yep.
And that's no longer the New Zealand we live in. I would love New Zealand to be, you know, a country again where you may grow up on the wrong side of the tracks, but you have just as much opportunity to be able to achieve the batch in the boat and the BMW as the next person. Where, you know, I'm aware of a family here in Fielding, and, you know, their young baby, they're feeding on UHT milk from the supermarket.
Yep.
And there's no other options for them, and you know, you can try and give them help, but actually there's so many holes in their budget or their needs to be plugged that where do you even start?
The other thing I think that feeds into that, Abby, and we'll get back on track soon, that in the UK for a long time, people could live that life of incredible wealth and not have to mix with this other world. My concern in New Zealand, that's starting to happen now as well, is that people can live a life and just belong to certain social circles. And this other thing is something that is just a statistic or whatever, and you don't have to interact with it. That's my concern. When I grew up, we were aware of everything that was going on in the village and the town and how everybody else was doing, and there was an interaction between all of that.
Oh, I was a Fielding Ag girl, you know, and my dad, as you know, he worked at Massey at the time in the vet faculty, and his colleagues, you know, were astonished that he was sending his daughters to Fielding. You know, he drove past Girls High every day on the way into Massey. He could, you know, why was he not taking us to Girls High, where we would be surrounded by the daughters of other academics and professional people? And, you know, the comment of my parents was they wanted us to grow up being aware of society. And, you know, my two best friends all the way through there came from families where things were very different to my own. I mean, I lived a very sheltered life. Tim constantly kind of teases me about that, but it was it was a safe, and we had everything we needed, and and to a certain extent, you know, you grow up and you take some of that for granted. And then it's not until I remember my mum encouraging my sister and I to volunteer at a charity shop on weekends, and, you know, people would come in and ask to put a $2 pair of jeans on, you know, effectively lay-by of, you know, could they pay 50 cents now? And, you know, this was a few years ago, mind you, $2 worth. But, you know, that kind of thing, and it just made you realise how much you took for granted. But I think you're right, that kind of awareness, or even if people are aware, I think sometimes it is so difficult or complex and they don't know how to solve it, so it's almost easier to just kind of push it away and go, I just won't go there, because what am I to do?
Okay, that was a little rabbit hole. Abby, the demographics in the world are changing. Population's getting older. Now, it's interesting to see in some countries that's becoming quite pronounced. And then, you know, demographics, I think, is something, I'm not sure if they're changing quicker than they have in the past. I have a feeling they might be. And you're seeing these sort of, you know, for instance, in Auckland, you know, very, very young population of Polynesian Maori coming through. That's going to have a huge effect there. How do you see the demographic changing in the world as far as our position as a food producer?
Well, I think one of the things that often is talked about, in, you know, when I'm involved in these sort of discussions about the future of food for New Zealand, that is the fact that this idea that there will always be a demand for these natural meat, natural milk. You know, people don't want to have these sorts of things growing in vats, and the technology is scary, and that will put consumers off. And then I go to conferences, or I go to expos, or you travel overseas, and you realize that there is a whole new generations of people coming through for whom they've grown up with technology all around them. And they don't find this scary in the slightest. In fact, I was talking to a young man in Singapore when I was over there, and he said to me he finds the idea of eating some kind of meat or cell that has come out of a very clean stainless steel vat where everything has been controlled to the nth degree so much more reassuring and nicer than the idea of eating meat from an animal where,
fecal matter and all that
and that it was a living being. He's got that kind of stuff about all of this kinds of and it just made me realize the lenses or the inherent assumptions and biases we all bring to things, and not everyone's going to have those same ones. We've grown up with this, but these next generations haven't. We've got this mass urbanization across the world, so fewer and fewer people have got that sort of knowledge or that connection to where the food is being produced. And so in many cases, the things that those of us who do kind of come from a food producing background or whatever, the things we think of as natural and nice and safe and all of that are almost the opposite for some of these other consumers. And I remember there was an interview, I think one of the senior people in Impossible Burger, who is, one of the large sort of alternative meat companies. They've got millions of dollars worth of investment in the States. And they said, how are you going to try and convince older people to eat, your product? And he said, we're not. We just work on the young guys. If we can get them to start eating our product when they're in their teens, we've got them for life. Because a lot of the challenges that they have with the plant-based equivalents of some of these things at the moment is they don't taste the same. But if you've never got used to having the flavour of meat or the texture of meat, if you don't have that as your holy grail of this is what we're trying to achieve, well, then you don't need to achieve it, do you? And so, his concept was effectively, those of us who want real meat are going to die off, and you're going to have these new ones coming through who actually are quite happy with the way that it is. And, I have spoken to some of the young students that hang around at Massey and various others, and a number of those girls do not like the taste of bovine milk. They find it off-putting. They don't like the creaminess. They prefer the almond or the oat or whatever. And it just all of a sudden made me pause and go, gosh, this assumption of what we're trying to achieve, of what good looks like, isn't necessarily going to be the same for this next generations as it has been for us.
My generation, when they found a job, it was about who could get the biggest pay packet. This generation coming through, it's not. No. And they will forego that money. They're still better at finding a decent lifestyle, but they will align themselves with a company that has got good values, is not fucking up the planet, is good for people, all that sort of stuff, way more than they'll align themselves with the highest pay packet. And they don't talk about that anymore.
No. And I think, this is this challenge of right now, we know the way the world is working. You project out 20, 30 years.
I'm not even sure it's that far out.
No. But, and I think, the other thing about demographics, and we briefly touched on this before we turned on the podcast, is we rely on young, fit, healthy people to produce most of our food in the world at the moment. And if we're getting this ageing population, and I only know the demographics off the top of my head from New Zealand, but I think it was at 2016, 15% of the population were over 65. And by 2050, they expect it to be 27% over 65. And by 2060, they think about a quarter of people will be over 85. We are having fewer and fewer young people, more and more older people. How are we going to be doing all of the work that needs to be done unless we start to be embracing automation, new ways of producing food that are less labour intensive. I mean, I was involved in some of the government sort of reports on different parts of the ecosystem, so food and beverage, fisheries, some of these sorts of things. And I remember as part of that having Shamabel Equab come in and talk to us at one of the MPI functions. And, you know, he was looking at the MPI, Ministry of Primary Industries, I guess, aspirations for the sector. And it was to have, I think, 10% more people working in it by whatever. And he was just like, this is absolutely absurd. There will not be 10% more people working anywhere. You know, if you're very, very lucky, you may have the same, and that's only if you're able to preferentially attract people into your sector away from other sectors. More likely, you're going to have to be making more food with less people. And, you know, I sat around a table with a bunch of senior execs from the sector, and one of them said, well, I guess I better pull out that proposal that I received a couple of years ago for automating my pack house and, you know, all of that kind of stuff, because at the time it was this great big capital expense, and it's so much cheaper and easier just to employ half a dozen extra people to pick up boxes and move them around and then, oh, if you're telling me I'm not going to be able to do that in future, I guess I should probably look at that kind of stuff.
What fascinates me with demographics is you can't ignore them. And I have been involved many years ago when I was the board chair of Little Bolton School and talking about the demographics, and people just had their head in the sand. I said, there are 8,000 less primary school kids in Wanganui and Manawatu than there were 5 years ago. 8,000 less children. And so I said, so that's a trend. You know, that's a big number for this population, and so we've got to look at how we modify our schools. And I was trying to bring them together more and create one central school, and I said, it's a trend. It's not going to stop. And two of the schools that we had in the conversation have since closed, and they've done nothing proactive to do that. But it was just, you know, demographics.
It's the silent kind of creeping thing that we're...
And it never sleeps.
No.
And once the trends start, once those trends are there and people know them, you've got to pay attention to them. Yeah. So, Abby, that's... What's this podcast about? and I say that because... And before, while you're thinking... We're going to have a follow-up conversation because I'll trick you into one and we're going to do another one, because this we could literally talk for hours. And so we're not today. We're going to do it again because, as I expected, you know a whole lot of stuff that we need to, that I think the whole purpose of this podcast is to get people like you, who are generally pretty silent, actually talking about what's going on. And I've talked to you about this before. I get frustrated in New Zealand. We've got some talking heads that people listen to, a very few number of people. Shamabel Equab was one of them. I mean, the guy's very, very interesting, but there's more people that we should be listening to, but often people are too modest to do that. So we've got over that with you, because this is a stunning podcast. What do you reckon this podcast is about?
Things that Abby finds interesting.
No. Seriously.
I think it's a start of a exploration around the future of New Zealand. I think, you know, there is this thing of the demographics, the inequities, the what do we want to say about New Zealand? What is New Zealand's identity as New Zealanders? What do we want from each other and from our country? And how are we going to afford to do this? Because at the moment, you know, when we think of our exports, I think about 40-something% come from agri-food. And, you know, is that going to be how we can earn our money that we need to buy the things we can't do in New Zealand for future? And I'm not sure we should be relying on that.
Yeah.
You know, I guess maybe that's part of the next one. Yeah. But I think there's this topic here of, at the moment, I don't see a vision for New Zealand in 20 years' time. And I find that really kind of a bit sad, but also a little bit scary. Because if you don't have a vision, how do you make decisions about what you're going to do and what you're saying yes to and what you're saying no to?
How do you stay on track?
Yeah. You know, it seems at the moment a lot of the things is, oh, we don't want that.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, okay. But where's the what do we want? Where is the what we do want to move towards? Where is the thing that's going to say, this is what is going to be, how do we make this a place that New Zealanders are proud to say that they are from New Zealand? And that they still want to live here and not just be living somewhere else and going, oh yeah, I grew up in New Zealand. It was a great place to grow up. But, you know, of course, I had to leave once I needed to get a real job.
Yeah. Yeah. I spotted a young farming family a few weeks ago. They're doing really well. And they had just taken on another task to make yet more money. And they're in this trap of just working harder and harder. And I couldn't help but think, goodness, that was the 1960s and 70s and 80s model. And it made me feel a little bit sad that, because when you're working that hard, you stop saying stuff.
But it is so common, Harv. I can reel off a whole bunch of people I know where they, in my sort of view of things, they have got themselves in this mindset of, I need to work hard now so that out there I will have the life that I want to have. And, you know, I also know a whole bunch of people who, as they get close to that life, end up having heart attacks or things go wrong and they never actually get to that life. And, you know, how do we find that balance of realizing that if you miss out on your kids growing up and you miss out on the time you've got when you're young and you're fit enough to do some of these things, I mean, I grew up in a family where my parents worked so hard. I have a deep-seated anxiety about sitting still and not doing things because it makes me feel that, oh my goodness me, I'm being lazy. But on the other hand, I also recognise, you know, Eleanor's 9 and boy, oh boy, is that time going fast. And so, you know, Tim and I are both fortunate we've been in positions where we've been able to choose to have lower FTEs, so neither of us work full-time. We probably do work full-time, but we don't get paid full-time because I know if you work full-time, you're expected to work 1.3 rather than, you know. But we're choosing to do that now so that we can do things together and spend time with Eleanor. And yep, might mean we don't have as much money to buy the fancy cars and to, you know, have a fancy house and all these sorts of things compared to some others. But for us, that's a compromise that we've chosen to make. And I do feel sometimes that people have got themselves caught up in this cycle that they're not making conscious choices about it. They've kind of been swept up by the career opportunities, the potential for the money, the potential for the status, you know, the what they could be doing, and they haven't actually paused to look at the opportunity cost of that.
On the way here this morning, I was talking to one of our members who is going to struggle to make her meeting next week with collective intelligence with her team. And I said to her, giving yourself time and space to stop and reflect and to be challenged might be just what you need. And she's like, oh yeah.
And I think we're all there though at times.
Oh, 100%. The interesting thing is that it's so easy, and I'm as guilty as the next person. It is so easy when you're in that, all you can see is just working harder. And that's my concern that New Zealand's got itself into, is that we need to be, you know, this place where we work hard. And there's a wonderful guy, Brian, I'll think of his name soon. And he's a marketing guy, and he said New Zealand has, and he was talking about farmers, have mastered the art of producing more for less. And he said, we've got to learn how to produce less for more. And he said that 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And we haven't got ourselves out of that yet. And because I think, if you ask me what this podcast is about, that I think that's what this podcast is about to me. Because I think that's what you're trying to work on, is to produce more value for the customer, making sure the planet's okay and the people are okay, and being really smart about it. That's what I think this podcast is about.
Yeah. And we have to be smarter. I mean, I am really excited about some of the things that AI is looking at doing. You know, they talk about a third of the food in the world that we produce is wasted before it actually, can get consumed.
And here in New Zealand.
Yep. And the potential to be much better at every part of that value chain. I mean, I know one of the guys at Massey, one of the professors there, has been working with Zespri for years, where they've now been able to develop a technology where they can have a camera over top of the kiwi fruit as they roll down the conveyor belt in the pack house, and they can assess the likely shelf life of those kiwi fruit and sort them so that you end up with those that are likely to go ripe faster can go into a box, so they are the first ones that are shipped, and then you've pulled those out of the others, and then the other boxes can stay in storage to be shipped later. Because you know what happens if you've got one that goes soft in a thing, the whole thing is ruined. And they're not 100% right, but it's, even if you're getting 80% of them out, and isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
Or the whole trying to actually manage better around, what we've done in the past often for foods is, in order to be able to control things in a consistent way, we'll take a raw material, so a seed, and we'll pull it apart into all of these individual white powders effectively, and that takes energy and time, and there's waste, and then we will put them back together in certain ways to make foods, because that way our brains could control, to get this outcome I need 3 grams of this and 2 kilos of that, and it would all then be the same. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually just grind up the seed and maybe just split it into a couple of different fractions, and know that those seeds, that's going to vary from batch to batch, from season to season, but that there is AI that can tell us, right, because we've got this specification on this, we've just got to add a bit more of that other thing, or you dial that up and dial that down, or we will change the processing on this or that, or, your milk's coming in. And I remember working as one of the student jobs, working in a dairy factory, and the waste that sometimes would happen because something would go wrong somewhere in the system and you'd have to dump a whole lot. Well, if you could have the sensors go, oops, we're heading a little bit off, and rather than needing the guy who's been there 50 years to go, we need to do something here, it would just automatically just shift things around and readjust it. I mean, there's so many things that I think that power of looking at large sets of data and being able to make decisions, which is so beyond our ability to comprehend, or look for trends that we never even knew existed.
Correct.
I think that's going to be really, really exciting. And I think, to me, I know there's this whole thing about, will AI take our jobs? Well, we've just talked before. We're going to need people. We're not going to have as many people to take jobs. We're going to need AI and automation to be able to do some of this work. But what I think is really exciting is going to be how do people start to be able to really utilize some of these tools, because they're going to get better and better. But in the meantime, they can't be replacing a person, but they can really augment what a person is able to do.
And get us to focus on the stuff that's actually important.
Yep. Let's take away so much of that routine stuff. Let's take away so much of the stuff that really, are we adding value by having a person doing that? And look at what we can get people to do instead. It was really interesting. They did some work at a factory, and I won't name any names, but they were trying to encourage increased numbers of people to want to work there. They were trying to get increased motivation. And so they had people doing very routine kind of jobs. And so they changed the pay. So they said, right, we will give you a higher base rate. So, when they started, you got a certain amount just for turning up each kind of hour. And then you got an extra amount for every piece that you made or you did during that time. So they increased the base rate because they thought that would make people feel better. And then what they found is that people actually got slower because they didn't need to earn as much from doing the piece rate, and it was kind of boring and they didn't really want to be there. And so they're like, oh, okay, that doesn't work. So, okay, we will take the base rate back down to what it was and we'll increase the piece rate. And then what they found was that people worked really fast and they only came in for 4 days and they called in sick on the 5th day because they'd made enough money on those 4 days to pay the bills that they needed to pay, and they didn't want to go to work. And so it was effectively trying to understand that, trying to motivate people to do boring stuff that they feel has no purpose. It just doesn't work. So how do we actually find a way of giving people jobs that are more interesting, where they feel that there is actually more value that they are contributing, where they feel they're contributing to something bigger, and let the robots and the automation do that other stuff?
Abby, on Tuesday, I consciously used AI for the first time.
Nice.
And it was for note-taking and summarising a meeting. Mm-hmm. And there's a little app that's free, and it listened to our conversation and spat out a summary that was really accurate.
Yeah.
And for the meeting. And it did the job that nobody else really wanted to do. And it was done.
Yep.
And I go, cool, that's great. We could concentrate just on this. And nobody was sitting there taking notes. Everybody was I'm going, okay, that worked.
Yeah. Because that's a job no one likes.
Nobody. Well, who do you give it to? You don't give it to the chairman. Oh, can the chair take the notes? The chairs go, no, I'm going to delegate that to somebody else. Nobody ever goes, yeah, I want to do that. No. And so, yeah. Abby, I'm going to end this conversation soon, purely because if I start another conversation, we're going to go another hour.
Yep.
Can I have permission to have another podcast with you, please?
Okay. Yes.
I've got that.
It hasn't been as scary as I thought it might.
This has been as interesting as I knew it would. The biggest surprise for me was Maruku is working in Australia, and I go, you know what? That's the way the world's heading. It's a bit like Rocket Lab.
Yep.
Is founded in New Zealand, but it's doing most of his work in the States. I'm okay with that. Yep. And we need to be not insular. Mm-hmm. We need to be global.
Yep.
Yeah. Abby, thank you for your time. Thank you for saying yes. You've agreed on air to do this again. And seriously, I think we'll find we'll go again very soon, because I'd love to unpick. I think it's really interesting because you're at this new frontier and you're actively involved in this new frontier, and I think it's really important for people to hear this story.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, we'll talk again soon then, Harv.
Abby, thank you for your time. Keep up the good work. To Amos, he wouldn't have listened to the end of this anyway. He would have heard his name at the beginning and gone, oh, yeah, okay, I'm cool. But look, thank you for doing this work, and good luck.